Perfect. You're just on time. I was about to tell my story. Now, when I was in the fourth grade, my mother took me to the local rent-a-game store called Hastings. May she rest in peace. And my mother, for whatever reason, allowed me to rent a game called Dead Space 2. And I confess I am not the beast now that I was when I was a child, but when I was a child, I would play a game from the moment I rented it, the instant to that I went to bed that evening. And as you might imagine, if you have any familiarity with Dead Space or Dead Space 2, 3, or the contents of these games, my 12-year-old, 10-year-old, I don't know how old you are in fourth grade, brain was ignited, alive with the horrors I had seen in the previous hours playing Dead Space 2. And I am not a religious person, or have ever particularly been, as you might be able to guess, but my parents found me the following morning with a Bible open across my lap. And I had fallen asleep reading it the night before, attempting to pray away the horrors, I suppose. And so naturally, this past Halloween, when I was looking for something spooky, something to excite the nerves, get into the spirit, I remembered back to this strong impression I had as a child. This scarring, perhaps, is a better word. And I remembered the remake for the first game. I thought it was odd that I never played the first game. I jumped straight to the second game. Why did I do that? But I remembered the first game, and I knew that a well-received remake had just come out. And so I played said remake, obviously, because we're here, we're watching the video. And I was taken back to a time, and this is the reason why I'm making the video. I was taken back to this time where I felt like passion was priority over video games as a franchise. I was taken back to a time before Black Ops 7, before Pokemon Legends, before it was about microtransactions and loot boxes, but it felt like game design and creative passion was the priority, was the status quo in making a game. And so today, in this video, I kind of wanted to take you through how I experienced this or felt this as playing through the Dead Space remake in a more structured video essay format. Now, this is my very first video like this, but I appreciate you watching this overly long intro at least, and I hope you stick around for the rest of it. Thank you.
Dead Space is a prime example of centering game development around creative passion, felt by the player in the meshing of the narrative, universe, and gameplay. And the self-contained experience of Dead Space is what I want to highlight today. And I want to start with how the story first ropes the player in, or the way you experience the narrative of Dead Space is through Isaac Clarke, who is a regular engineer. And this is a very specific and I believe intentional lens, somewhat akin to Sigourney Weaver's character Ripley in the movie Alien. Both characters are established positions within the ship. You exist within this predefined position in the group, and as such, the narrative is driven through that lens. It becomes more specific. And then this idea is expanded upon and manifests in the weapons that you use throughout the game. The iconic plasma cutter is a tool. It is not a rifle or a traditional pistol. It is a tool presumably used for welding or cutting. And the way Dead Space weaves together Isaac Clarke as an engineer and then the sandbox, the game's weapons, by making them tools rather than an assault rifle or a sniper rifle or rocket launcher, but making them tools and giving them unique functions that are sort of being repurposed to kill the necromorphs outside of their original intended use, I think furthers this idea that you are an engineer kind of struggling to make sense of what to do in this situation. And this idea is reinforced in cutscenes. Cutscene with Jacob, a miner on the Ishimura, who's seen holding a gravity gun, which he later used in the game, leading you to imagine the intended use of the gravity gun being perhaps to hold rocks and push them into the mining well, or to launch them into the mining well, hauling around these unimaginably heavy bits of material using the gun, which then Isaac takes and repurposes to fight the necromorphs because it's all he can do. It's what he knows to do. He's trying his best, and you see this also with telekinesis and stasis, which are both abilities intended and used to fix things within the Ishimura, but also are key components of fighting the necromorphs. And Isaac completes this story because he is an engineer, because he's a common man having to think on the fly. He's not a trained soldier, so he's shooting the limbs off the necromorphs and then using telekinesis to fire them back at them. And so from a pure gameplay perspective, what they do is they set up a scenario or an environment in which ammo is almost unnecessary in launching things like blades, tails. Players have the flexibility to use necromorphs' own bodies, their own forms, against them. But Isaac being an engineer impacts more than just the approach to the sandbox, but also the way in which you traverse the ship. Throughout the story of Dead Space, you see various sections of the ship, the engine, the centrifuge, mining, etc., But these are all locations that, were you not Isaac Clarke, the ship engineer, you would not otherwise have access to. His teammates, Hammond and Daniels, literally don't know how to do the things Isaac can do, and as such never see the environments or the areas, the playable areas that the player gets to, as he is a competent engineer making suggestions and providing solutions as they go through the story. The supporting cast in many cases just sort of has to go along for the ride. For instance, the very first area you enter the game, the engineering deck, feels like the belly of the beast. Again, returning to the comparison of Alien, it feels like the engineering deck of the Nostromo, which is heavy machinery feel, pipes, and a sort of unknowableness about what might be within the pipes or just beyond the walls around you. Act 1, a log mentions that there's noise coming from the gears, or from the spaces where no one could be. The Ishimura feels both claustrophobic and frighteningly unknowable. And when you're traversing through engineering deck, occasionally there are these cavernous spaces with fog covering the floor, so you can't quite gauge just how far down it goes. And then alternatively, there's the mining deck, which is far removed from the cramped spaces of engineering decks of the Ishimura. But at the engineering decks of the veins of the Ishimura, the mining deck is the roaring heart and mouth of the Ishimura. It almost feels like it's feeding on the rocks, entering through the mining well. And again, there's this sense of sharp, deadly mechanical presence, but serving a different purpose, that of digestion. Gameplay-wise, you also come across the echoes of the recently departed, manifest in the traps left behind the miners just recently killed in the mining deck. Isaac makes a comment on them, noting sort of the human resilience within the final stand of the miners, blending the gameplay element with the world and the narrative. And more broadly, the presence of humanity is an interesting note on the Ishimura. And in many ways, it feels like humanity has been succeeded by its achievements of space travel. You sort of feel that human insignificance in the moments in which Isaac leaves the ship, and you see just how vast the Ishimura actually is. And then as the events of the story take place, you contrast that with the evolution presented by the marker. And again, humanity feels outclassed, but Isaac, a common man, an everyday working engineer, as opposed to a sort of COD war hero, you know, a ghost or a roach type. And it feels like the indomitable human spirit at its finest. Isaac Clarke versus an ancient cosmic horror. And maybe my favorite instance in the entire game, actually, of environmental storytelling expands both this concept of the human spirit and the metaphorical body of the Ishimura with a new area. Shortly after peeling off the remaining Leviathan off the hull of the Ishimura, the Valor rams into the Ishimura and you board it to defuse a nuclear warhead without setting it off by mistake. This moment naturally introduces a new type of enemy, which is much welcome in the existing pool, but it also expands the stakes of the story with learning about the CEC's awareness of the outbreak, and in fact a nuke protocol that they had ready on standby to blow up the entire Ishimura were it to be deemed too infected. Now this is a fact that is explained to you through Hammond eventually, but you have the opportunity to actually discover that for yourself, found in a log laying around the ship before Hammond's reveal. Very chilling to read it there for yourself. And despite the odds, Isaac conquers the infected soldiers and disables the nuke. And I realized here that Isaac is badass because he just keeps going. He doesn't have any cool voice lines. He doesn't say like,
I need a weapon.
He just keeps going. At the end of that section, the game neatly wraps up in a bow, having you blasted out of the Valor, hurtling through space until Isaac just barely grabs onto the shield dish array, which then pulls you into a familiar location, full circling the moment. In addition to just the areas themselves containing moments of storytelling, the puzzles you solve in them are also related to the narrative. Obviously, the nuke is rather self-explanatory, but the puzzles you go through the course of the game are instances of undoing someone else's handiwork, and you later find that Kyne is the one Dr. Kyne, is the one sabotaging the engine, sabotaging the comms array, or the purifier tubes, which have been overloaded intentionally by the crew to try and burn away the gas spreading from the Leviathan. And it's this sort of making the puzzles fit within the world which makes them feel worthwhile, and not just a fetch quest or a complete objective X, complete objective Y sort of slog. There's logs, supplemental materials that you can find around the Ishimura related to these things. And, once again, bolster Isaac's importance to this story, as only he, from the entire team who arrived on the Ishimura, has the capability or the qualifications to even begin to solve these issues. By also directly tying the puzzles of the Ishimura to the world, the game itself, you build tension naturally within the player. For what reason was the comms array sabotaged? Was it the crew? Or was it something worse? Was it the necromorphs themselves? Or was it even the marker? Now, Dead Space has a human antagonist, Dr. Mercer, and he's a decent enough villain, but anyone who's ever played Dead Space before knows the real villain is the marker itself. And the marker is incredible. I mean, for most of the game, it just sits there menacingly.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
But it itself is sort of this Lovecraftian antagonist whose Call Cthulhu-esque ability to speak to human DNA has a profound effect on the story and its characters. Returning to the previous metaphor of the body parts of the Ishimura, if the Ishimura is a body, then it is a rotting corpse. Then its beating heart is the marker. As the game progresses, you see the extent of the infestation. At first, when you board the Ishimura, it seems more or less as one would expect a spaceship to be. As you continue through the game, you see a fleshy substance that consumes the walls, the roof, the ceiling, and you find crew members grafted into the walls in the process of being consumed into this fleshy infrastructure the marker is creating. Another one of my favorite details is as you spend time on the Ishimura and the story unfolds, the necromorphs gradually become more and more necrosed, rotting away as time passes on board and the flesh begins to break down. But it's not only the body of the Ishimura, so to speak, but the soul itself that the marker corrupts. The soul being the screens, the voices within the Ishimura. As early as the first power outage in Act 1, on the way to repair the circuit board, you see flashing, changing lines on the ever-present orange screens within the Ishimura. And as early as Chapter 3, maybe even before then, you hear whispers throughout the halls. As I was playing this game for the first time, more than once I took off my headphones fully and looked over at my girlfriend who was sitting behind me because I thought she'd said something. And you see various instances of the Ishimura's quote-unquote soul being influenced and infected by the marker, but one of my favorites is when you're repairing the comm array, and before you do so, all the screens in that area are flashing images of the marker or symbols or the script, and once you return the comm array to its working state, all the screens return to normal. And around that area you can find logs talking about strange voices coming through the array, voices that couldn't have been there. And I love that idea of the marker blending the technical and the mystical, speaking through the comm array to the crew, pushing them to insanity. Crew quarters is especially interesting because the physical metaphor of the marker is its presence in the crew quarters, where the unitologists, the people who worship the marker, have brought it there, and its tendrils creeping out from the marker, infecting the individual rooms and places where people once lived. Overt metaphor for the way in which the marker crept into the mind of the crew, beginning with the unitologists and seeping into the everyday life. And then in other instances, we see the marker act as a direct antagonist to Isaac. When Isaac makes moves against the Leviathan, the marker reaches out through Nicole. Nicole contacts Isaac in the elevator, singing to him, begging him, and it soon begins to work on Isaac, directly angling itself through Nicole. And the entire time it's stringing Isaac along, maybe the player, although I would argue they sort of overplay their hand with the make us whole thing. The marker, working against Isaac directly, misdirects him into believing that returning the marker to Aegis 7 will stop the marker's agenda, will end it all, until finally, final moment with the marker before the finale. At this point, the player has become dubious of Isaac's well-being as Nicole, quote-unquote, becomes less and less subtle with her make-us-whole pleads to Isaac. And the game sets up this interesting parallel between Dr. Kyne and Isaac. Dr. Kyne is someone who's deeply affected by the marker and is seen throughout the course of the game talking to his hallucinated wife. Obviously not there, either missing within the ship or long dead. And as suspicion around Isaac himself grows within the player, you reach a point at which you start to wonder, was the same not true for Isaac? And then finally the game throws us one last loop when Nicole is revealed to not be merely a hallucination like Kyne's wife, who was never real, but in fact Elizabeth Cross. And in that moment with the Cross reveal, we see the full video Nicole left behind. We realize that Isaac knew she was dead this entire time. In fact, he says so. We realize Isaac, unable to cope with the loss of his girlfriend, is the perfect vessel for the marker. And from the start, the guilt Isaac carried was food for the marker, snapped up and used to control an everyday engineer who was all too willing to imagine a world in which his girlfriend was still alive, a world where he could still set things right. And then the details begin to fall into place. We get the full picture of a story about a man in denial, crafted with passionate attention to detail and measured foreshadowing. Suddenly it clicks why Daniels loses Isaac's signal the first time you meet Nicole. Just like how Hammond's signal is lost when he approaches the marker. When the Valor is moments away from crashing into the Ishimura, Isaac's last words are hinting at a truth he himself knows deep inside. And the crazy that the player sees in Kyne is simply a man trying to fix his guilt over having brought this icon of death and corruption on board. And now with Isaac fully revealed, we realize he himself is also a man trying to fix his guilt over Nicole's death. But the deaths of any number of cosmic horrors, small or 4 stories tall in the case of the Hive Mind, cannot solve it for him. And just like that, the story of Isaac Clarke ends where it begins, finishing with the opening log video, and in doing so finally facing the reality which he so desperately buried, pleading a full and precise circle. Unless, on the flights to Aegis 7 at the end of the game, Isaac suffers a couple of blackouts, which functionally serve to expedite the trip to the surface of the planet, but thematically indicate a lapse in his memory, or that he's become so compromised by the marker he is in and out of a state of consciousness. As I had never played the original Dead Space, I did not know that it was exclusive to the remake until after my first completion of the campaign, but the Dead Space remake introduces an alternate ending that I'm going to mention because I think it also perfectly exemplifies the amount of care and passion invested in this game. Throughout the course of the campaign, the player can collect pieces of the marker hidden throughout the Ishimura. Thinking about these blackouts that Isaac suffers at the end of the game, I began to wonder if the player doesn't act as the marker, compelling Isaac to collect the pieces unknowingly, in a similar blackout instance for him, pushing him further into madness. Now, the alternate ending is not just a new cutscene, but a truer and more terrifying look into just how far Isaac has fallen by the end of the game. If one collects all the pieces of the marker and arranges them on the table, from the end of the game on, the lines between Isaac and Nicole are largely changed, indicating a darker or consumed by the marker side of Isaac. Prior to landing, Isaac's usual line is replaced with a cheery, "Nothing to fear." And again, when Isaac is moving the marker through Aegis 7, talking with Nicole, she asks if he misses them, which typically he would interpret as his mother, but in the alternate ending says,
The marker saw who they really were. I don't remember them.
and finally, when battling the hive mind at the end of the game,
Show me what I have to do! You can't stop me!
yelling at the top of his lungs. And while the alternate ending does disrupt the nice circular structure of the original ending, leaving it a bit more open-ended, I think it demonstrates the extent of the rot gripping Isaac, who has now embraced illusion. He's now a willing vessel for the marker's purpose.
Well, there you have it. My take on the Dead Space remake. If you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around. I super appreciate it. I know it was a long video, a kind of dense video, and not too terribly well written, but I super appreciate you watching. This is my first time making a video like this, or any sort of structured video really like this. So I appreciate any feedback or any criticisms, comments, please leave them below, and stick around for what I do next. Thank you.